Hello everyone and welcome to episode 56 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I visit with Carlos Ayers, a noted compliance practitioner in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He's going to talk about the recently enacted Brazilian anti-corruption law and things that U.S. companies need to do to comply with that law. I hope you enjoy the episode. Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I'm really pleased to have our first South American guest, my colleague and good friend Carlos Ayers from Sao Paulo. He is with the firm of Trench, Rossi, and Watanabe?
Yes, Watanabe.
Okay. He is it the correct phrase to say that your firm is associated with Baker & McKenzie here in the United States?
Yes, that's right.
I have had the opportunity to meet Carlos. He is one of the top compliance and ethics practitioners in Sao Paulo. We met at a conference last year. We have corresponded over the past couple of years. For the American audience, you might recognize his name from a couple of the publications that most of us read, the FCPA blog, which he is a contributor for, and also with Matt Ellis on the FCPA Americas blog. That's really an interesting publication because you guys have taken the step of publishing both in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, which I think is a fabulous resource for the compliance community in South and Latin America. So kudos to you all for doing that. I've been wanting to have you come on the show, and hopefully we're going to talk about some of the pretty exciting events that have happened in Brazil recently in the areas of anti-corruption and anti-bribery, and hopefully we'll have a little time to talk about the upcoming World Cup. I think the World Cup is a great way to introduce the topic. Obviously, the world is going to be watching Brazil this summer in June and July, and again in 2016. Many of us here in America wondered what that would mean for corruption in Brazil. And the country, in the form of the government and the people, have took some pretty dramatic steps to combat that. You've written about that quite a bit. So could I maybe just start off by asking how does Brazil fight corruption? What new laws are in place? And how do you see the landscape?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me to participate on this podcast today, which I follow religiously. And as you mentioned, the Brazilian government has taken important steps in the fight against corruption. And the Brazilian government is closing ranks against corruption using different tools. And some of the tools used by the Brazilian government can be used as example by other governments in the region and elsewhere. So I think the first important step is that the Brazil increased the enforcement of its own anti-bribery law. So according to the local media, between 2008 and 2012, there was an increase of 133% on the number of individuals that were convicted for active and passive corruption, which is a very impressive number. It's 7 times higher than the increase of the incarcerated population in the same period. And the federal police has been very active as well. In 2013 alone, the federal police has carried out more than 200 special operations to combat corruption, money laundering, and related crimes. And we have also seen an exchange of information among local authorities and also of Brazilian authorities with foreign authorities. So the increase of enforcement is one area that the Brazilian government, improved. Also, Brazil is not only enforcing its anti-corruption laws in its effort to fight corruption. Transparency has been seen as important to detect and prevent corruption. And in that regard, since 2004, the federal government has maintained a transparency portal where anyone can obtain information, among other things related to direct spending of the federal government, information about public procurement, contracts, per diem pay to public employees, amount of pay to office supplies, and the state and municipalities are following it. And it's very interesting because, all this information is made publicly available almost in real time. So, all the expense of the previous day are made available the next day on the internet. So that creates, puts the population and the press, to fight corruption. And the federal government also keeps a list with names of individuals and companies that have been debarred or suspended. And as of yesterday, that list had around 10,000 names, which, it's important for companies doing their due diligence in Brazil to check that information. And there is another very interesting tool that the Brazilian government has been used, which is data analytics. So the federal government has been used there for a while, and the Office of the Municipal Comptroller General, CGM, in the city of São Paulo, which is a special unit designed to further enhance the city efforts against corruption, they did a very interesting exercise. What they did is that they got the list of municipal employees and run that list against the city's real estate property tax database. And they realized that, some hundred of employees, they were living beyond their income. They would have to work several years without spending a penny in order to be able to afford all the assets that they had just in real estate. And that led to enforcement actions related to some tax inspectors and license and obtained by Brazilian authorities is said to be having shared Brazil has implemented new laws to fill some gaps on its own existing legislation, and also to fill its commitments at the international level, at the conventions that Brazil is signatory. So, a lot has been said about the new anti-bribery law. Brazil has also passed a new anti-money laundering law in 2012, which is very harsh. And, despite the significant progress made by the Brazilian government, there is, of course, a lot to be done, but at least all these, steps taken seems to show that the country is going in the right direction.
Carlos, many American and UK, or perhaps companies from all over the world, might be coming to Brazil to help with the efforts to construct for the 2016 Olympics. What would be your opinion, or rather, what would be your advice to foreign companies coming to Brazil to comply with the new Brazilian anti-corruption law?
That's a very good question, Tom, because, well, first of all, they should expect strong enforcement, right? The enforcement authorities have said in public events that they plan to enforce the law vigorously, and they have already trained their staff on the new anti-bribery law. So first of all, they should expect that. Secondly, I would say that the companies need to update their compliance programs, because even if a company has a very effective compliance program, which is sufficient to prevent FCPA and UK bribery violations, not necessarily that will cover, be sufficient for the Brazilian law, because substantial parts of the prohibited acts set forth in the new legislation, they are related to public tender and public procurement, not necessarily linked to corruption. So, and these areas are often problematic. There is a very thin line of what can be done and what cannot be done. So employees often, makes mistake, not only because they want to violate the law, but because they don't know what can be done. So I think training is a key feature, in public procurement. So, enhance that area. So I think that's one important step. I think third-party due diligence, it's very important too. I know that this is already important under the FCPA and UK Bribery Act, but in Brazil, that can be even more problematic because the law allows companies to be held liable just because they benefit from the conduct. The company does not need to have knowledge or have authorized the conduct. As long as they benefit from it, they can, be held liable. So I think, companies need to enhance their due diligence process. I think it's important that, many times the companies, they do very good due diligence. They check all sorts of public lists available on the internet and in other resources, but they forget to look at the local list of the barred individuals and entities. And, that's a list that is kept by the same authorities that will enforce it, in some cases at the federal level and an international level. So it's very important to take a look on that. And, in many instances, information is publicly available in Brazil, like the court records. We can easily obtain information about whether or not the company is being, involved in litigation that might lead to corruption issues. So it's very important to take a deep look on the third parties.
Carlos, I really didn't give justice to really the breadth and scope of your education and professional efforts in anti-corruption, but you have obviously a law degree in Brazil, but you also have a comparative law degree from the University of Florida. You have interned for the Securities and Exchange Commission. You have worked in the United States. You have represented United States companies in your work in Sao Paulo, obviously. But what would you say is the knowledge of Brazilian companies about the various anti-corruption laws, whether it be the local Brazilian legislation, the UK Bribery Act, or the FCPA, from really, you've seen it from both sides now, and you've seen it for some period of time. Is it increasing? What would you say the state of knowledge? If I'm a U.S. company, I want to come to Brazil, are they going to understand there are certain things we need to do?
Yes, I think I would say there is still a gap between the U.S. and Brazil, I would say. I think, the companies in the U.S., they have been subject to the FCPA for, a long time, so they are more used to anti-corruption issues than a Brazilian company. But the Brazilian companies are I think they are improving. It started with the companies that were doing with business with entities that are subject to the FCPA, which force them to act and to do business in an ethical way. So I think it started that way. And then we also have the Brazilian companies that are subject to the FCPA because they are like public traded. So we see a movement of those companies, for a long time already, to try to improve and comply with the law. And now we see a new trend because this new law, in addition to being very harsh, with severe penalties, it also gives credit for compliance program on the other hand. And that's a new feature under the Brazilian anti-corruption arena because until the recent past, before this law was enacted, Brazil would give no credit for compliance program. So even if a company had a state-of-art compliance program, it would get no credit for it. So I think, and until the recent past, we would see that the majority of companies that had a compliance program in place or those that were subject to the FCPA. So the law is already changing on that. And we saw that even before the law came into force, many companies were already implementing their compliance programs, and that's a good thing. So I see that change. Companies are looking after trying to develop a compliance program or improve. And Brazil new anti-corruption law, as I said, gives credit, right, for compliance program, and it requires the federal government to issue regulation on compliance programs. And it's very unfortunate that more than 3 months after the law came into force, the regulation has not yet been published. It's said that it's waiting presidential approval, but hopefully that will come out soon. I have participated in some public events where some authorities at the federal level participate, and they gave some insight and continue their positive attitude to discuss the law and the regulation with civil society about the criteria for the evaluation of compliance programs. So apparently they will take a 3-step approach, where first they are going to look at the structure of the program. So they're going to look at the existing mechanisms, whether or not the company conducts like a risk assessment, that there is a hotline in place. And the second step would be analyze the specifics of the legal entity, the number of employees where the company does business, to make sure that the structure of the program is appropriate for the specific needs and risks of the company. And the third point would be the evaluation of the efficiency of the compliance program. So they plan to see, what were taken in terms of remediation actions. And it's interesting because apparently they plan to give a lot of weight on whether or not senior management was involved. And so, especially in situations in which senior management is involved, apparently very limited credit, if any, is going to be given. So it's very important to have a culture where there is a good tone at the top. So when having like executives to look after the Latin America operations in Brazil, it's very important to make sure that senior management is aware of these and supports the compliance program of the company.
Carlos, you've been one of the certainly the leading practitioners I've met in the anti-bribery and anti-corruption space, and I'm going to read this, so I hope I get it right. You co-chair the Anti-Corruption and Compliance Committee of the Brazilian Institute of Business Law. I mentioned in my opening that you are one of the regular contributors to the FCPA Americas blog, and then of course that you all have now translate your posts into both Spanish and Portuguese. With this sort of information that's coming into the compliance community, have you personally seen the compliance community grow or become more sophisticated in Sao Paulo or Brazil? Certainly it's more than just U.S. expats coming down there now.
Yes, there is a huge market growing of compliance practitioners in Brazil. And I think especially in-house, this is a recent trend in Brazil. And we see, people trying to get information where to learn more about, compliance practice. And there is the Legal Ethics and Compliance magazine in Brazil, which is the leader compliance magazine in Brazil, and they launched a course to train compliance officers last year. And in fact, the last class was this Saturday, and I was able to teach a few classes there, and it's amazing. We had like 80 students in the class, people from different companies, different industries, that they were looking, to find information, about this. With the blog also, it's, many people write comments. They wanted to address a specific topic. So I think it's interesting to see, the discussions growing. I started to work with anti-corruption when, this was not a big thing in Brazil. It was primarily like U.S. companies, but now it's, much beyond that. Brazilian people are trying to educate themselves. Many of them go to the US and try to pursue an LLM. Others, read a lot of materials, and it's amazing because a lot of information is available out there, right? You have your blog, which is an incredible source of material, and I think you should be on the reading list of everybody who is trying to educate themselves on this area, reading the DPAs, even if it's like related to the FCPA, you learn a lot, how to, the compliance programs were structured, how, the problems happen at the companies. So I think this new law has created, an entire new environment in Brazil, and not only in terms of what people are doing, but the mentality. I think it changed a lot, and we see many people talking about anti-corruption and compliance that I would not expect to see that like 10, 15 years ago.
Carlos, we're nearly at the end of our time, but I wondered if anyone wanted to get some more information from you or follow up on any of the points that you raised. Would it be possible for them to send you an email? And if so, how would they do that?
Yeah, if anyone has any doubt and would like to follow up, feel free to send me an email, or can follow also at the blog. We will continue to monitor what's going on in Brazil, so feel free to do so. We continue to cover what's to expect from the new legislation. The federal regulation is about to come out any day soon, so feel free to reach out by email.
Carlos, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on to the podcast and visit with me, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate and I really enjoy doing it. Thank you.
Thank you.